This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
A very good morning to you, and welcome to Saturday Morning Breakfast. Today we are talking about wise feedback, a very specific form of giving feedback, and not just making sure that you are channeling your inner Confucius.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. It is indeed Saturday, the 14th of September, 2024. I hope that you have had a good week. As we talked about at the top of last week's show, the first week of term was not great here at Saturday Morning Breakfast, but this week, I must say, has been much improved, even with the inclusion of a Friday the 13th. I think we've got a couple of Friday the 13ths this year. I think I read that we've got one in December as well. So we're trying to ward off as much bad luck as we can, because we know that things can be difficult enough as they are without the universe conspiring against us on these random days of the week. I always think Friday the 13th is an interesting one because of how people react to it. You get the people who are, like me, if I'm being honest, very superstitious. I am a superstitious person. I like to say that I'm not, but I am. I don't walk under ladders. I salute magpies. I'm scared of Friday the 13th. Then you get the people who try to be very, very logical about it, and they're just like, oh, it's just another day, ignore it. Anything that goes wrong on Friday the 13th is just a coincidence, which is fair enough. I completely get that. Then you get the people who go the other way. And this has been a trend that I've noticed only over the past few years on social media, although it may have been a thing for longer and I just didn't know. But you get the people who really embrace Friday the 13th and who kind of really lean into it, which I thought was quite refreshing. I saw so many posts on social media yesterday about, different ways to bring yourself good luck on Friday the 13th. Lots of hugging black cats, which I appreciate, which I think is a very good way to bring yourself good luck as a cat person. And I always think it's really interesting because, I'm interested in holidays and these kind of events of cultural significance. I do think it's really interesting how we ascribe significance to Friday the 13th, particularly in the Anglophone world, because, of course, it's not Friday the 13th that is bad luck everywhere. In Spain, for example, Tuesday the 13th is bad luck, which I didn't know until one of the Spanish teachers at my previous school told me. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And so, it is, as a languages teacher, as a classicist, it is one of the things that I am really interested in. These things that you can kind of assume are universal, but they're really, really not. And they are actually quite arbitrary about how they crop up. Tim has texted in a very good morning to you. As long-term friends of the show know, Tim is a very long-term friend of the show. He has been here since day one because he was my very first and my very second guest, because our first shows didn't go as smoothly as I like to think they do now. And it wasn't even Friday the 13th when he came on, because, of course, we are on a Saturday. So Tim has texted in and he says, I tried to be logical about it, but then refused to do anything that could go wrong. I think that is a very good way to see it. I think, if you just say that you are logical, because as we know, as long as you say something, it's true. You don't need to actually do the actions to back it up. You can just say it, and that makes it true. But then position yourself to make sure that nothing can go wrong. And actually, while that's a very funny point, I do think it's a very good point, because I do think that I was going to say lots of people, and maybe that's true. I do think it's very easy, particularly on these days where we are hyper aware of things that could go wrong anyway, for us to set ourselves up to fail. I think it could be very easy to wake up on the Friday the 13th and go, oh, it's Friday the 13th. And instead of just ascribing things that go wrong to that day, you actually put things in motion to make things go wrong. Not deliberately, necessarily, but I was on a course on Tuesday evening, and it was quite interesting because the presenter talked about, how often do we come out of lessons and beat ourselves up because, the lesson went wrong because we hadn't planned it thoroughly enough. The meeting wasn't as productive as it could have been because we didn't come up with an agenda beforehand. So, how often actually do things go wrong that we can quite easily ascribe to the universe, to Friday the 13th, to whatever higher or lower power you may or may not believe in, but are, in fact, if we're very honest and very reflective about the events leading up to it, are events that we ourselves had a hand in. And I think, because, I do like to look for meaning in things. I do like to, as I talk about a lot on the show, particularly at this time of year, because in the UK, we don't have very many holidays. We don't have very many bank holidays. We don't have very many jours fériés, as we say in French, which translates to bank holiday, but it's like a celebratory day. We don't have very many of those. And so I think it can be good to take days like Friday the 13th that may seem quite arbitrary, and that you can ascribe something to if you want to, and make that ascription, decide that it's going to be important for you, just to bring a little bit of joy or a little bit of fun into your life. The people who try and make Friday the 13th into a positive thing by watching horror films or, reading scary stories or something. It's fun. You can turn it into a little bit of a holiday if you want to. But thankfully, we are over Friday the 13th now. And like I said, it has been a much better week here at Saturday Morning Breakfast than last week was. I'm looking over my my schedule for the week, and I must say it hasn't been as productive. It has not been as productive by any stretch of the imagination. But it has been a much more uplifting week, maybe an easier week, we can say. And hopefully lots of you are feeling that same way, that now we are a couple of weeks into term, you're kind of beginning to feel like you're in the swing of it, and beginning to get to grips with whatever the 2024-2025 academic year may bring. We are talking feedback today. We're going to look at wise feedback, which is a really interesting concept of feedback that I had never heard of until a couple of weeks ago, when I was doing some reading for an assignment that I'm writing. And I kind of read the title of this study, and it coined this term wise feedback. And I thought, oh, okay, so this is just going to be about being deliberate. This is just going to be about, making sure that your feedback is useful. And then I read the study, and that's really not what it's about. I'm not actually sure why it's called wise feedback. I haven't got to the bottom of where that name comes from. But it is a very interesting way of giving feedback that really made me think about how I give feedback, why I give feedback, and the people to whom I give it. And so I'm hoping that over the course of this morning, you will feel just as enlightened by this concept as I have.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the programme with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for BetUK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, BET has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC reports that the Scottish Government has been defeated in a vote calling on ministers to expand free school meals to all primary school pupils. Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth said the government was committed to the universal rollout of the free meals, but that funding was not available due to financial pressures. The Scottish Government said the expansion would be limited to P6 and P7 pupils in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment, after First Minister John Swinney confirmed £500 million worth of cuts. The government cited prolonged Westminster austerity and record inflation as the main reasons for the funding gap. Scottish Conservative education spokesperson Liam Kerr submitted a motion calling on the government to give the meals to all primary pupils this parliamentary session, as promised, and said the SNP had shamefully betrayed Scotland's poorest pupils. The non-binding motion passed by 64 votes to 2. 60 abstentions were recorded. Children's Commissioner Nicola Killian said the rollback on universal free school meals was a broken promise to children, and that the move would exacerbate stigma and shame around free school meals. Schools Week covers the Education and Skills Funding Agency, which will be integrated into the core Department for Education by March next year. The move will happen over 2 stages and give schools a single point of contact for financial management and support. The ESFA is currently an executive agency of the Department for Education. Schools' financial support and oversight function will transfer from October the 1st and be brought together with the Regions Group, 9 areas overseen by regional directors. This will support the launch of regional improvement teams by January. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson said this will provide a single seamless voice to schools and ensure that financial improvement is central to school improvement. Funding and assurance functions will be centralised on March 31st next year, when the ESFA will close. Set up in 2017, the agency is responsible for delivering and assuring £75 billion worth of funding for 25,000 educational settings. But the ESFA is the second education-related quango to be axed under the new government. The Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education is expected to close by April. ASCL have welcomed the changes if it produces a more efficient and joined-up approach to the oversight of school and college funding, but also said it would not solve the overriding problem that the current level of school and college funding is totally inadequate. The TES says that there are serious dangers in assuming schools are back to normal post-COVID. This is according to a report commissioned by Head Teachers and Leaders Union ASCL. Tim Oates, Group Director of Assessment Research and Development at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, writes in the report that schools are still dealing with challenges. The report warns that schools will continue to see challenges unfold for the next 5 to 10 years, as children whose development was impacted by the pandemic move through the system. The paper comes as 5 children's rights organisations has called on the government to remove the long shadow of the pandemic from children's lives. The report says the range of problems include increasing absence, widened attainment gaps, impacted reading and maths progress for certain groups, and worsening mental health and social and emotional skills. It also warns of research showing that children who were born or were very young during the pandemic face diminished social, cognitive and language development. Mr. Oates says the government must urgently work to remedy these problems rather than accepting them. A Department for Education spokesperson said it is determined to improve the life chances of all children. Finally, in the USA, KSBY News reports that California proposes a ban on large loads of homework in public schools. Assembly member Pilar Schiavo has authored the Healthy Homework Act, which would not ban homework, but which would mandate local school boards and educational agencies to establish homework policies that consider impacts on students' physical and mental health, with input from parents, teachers and students. The proposal comes as a survey of more than 300,000 American students, conducted by Stanford University, shows that 45% of students say workload and homework are their number one causes of stress. And 13,000 California high school students who took the survey report an average of 2.5 hours of homework every night. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
I think homework's really interesting because as I've talked about on the show before, I trained primary, and so homework was not something we really had a lot of training in because, when I trained, primary schools didn't really give homework. You gave spellings so that they could have their weekly spelling test, and, they were expected to read and you would check their reading records. But we never really did any lectures on homework. We never looked at any of the studies on homework because it wasn't something that informed our practice as I was training. And then when I made that transition from primary to secondary, I kind of just started giving homework because that was my school's policy and it was just what secondary schools do. And I kind of just assumed that the policymakers at the school had read the research. They had done the training. They had trained secondary, so they kind of knew what they were doing. And so I think homework quite often is something that is just culturally instituted, and we give it because that's what we do. And I think sometimes there can be a bit of a backlash against this idea of reducing homework. Homework is important because it increases our students' opportunities to learn. It increases their contact with the material. It increases the opportunities that they have to pick up new information. But as I've talked about on the show before, school and school mandated activities and assignments are not the only ways that children can learn. And I think if we actually took a realistic view of cultural capital, obviously the news that Joe was reporting on there is based in the US, in California specifically. But I think this applies just as well to the UK, and probably to any country that dishes out a lot of homework. I think if you looked at the infrastructure of the country, if you looked at the cultural capital to which your children had access, I think if you looked at the number of libraries and museums and youth clubs and sports centres and children's services, social services, then homework could be reduced, because as teachers we could be confident that the children then had access to other opportunities to learn, to other opportunities of keeping their minds active, of having contact with what we are teaching them outside of the classroom. One of the things that I always say about languages when issues of timetabling comes up is the fact that languages are best done little and often. You are much, much better as a language learner doing one 45-minute, 50-minute, hour long, however long your lesson might be, but doing one lesson every day, as opposed to, a double lesson 2 hours every other day, or 2 hours twice a week. Because one of the core things about language is that you keep revisiting it. It's how we pick up our mother tongues. It's how I learned English, was the fact that my parents and my grandparents and everybody around me kept speaking to me. And so I had that constant contact with the language, and so I picked it up. And it's the same with all subjects. It's the same with life skills. It's the same with critical thinking. It's the same with everything. The more contact you have with something, the more exposed you are to something, the better you're going to learn it, the deeper you're going to understand it. So I personally have no issue with the idea of reducing homework. And now that I know about this thing in California, I will be keeping an eye on it, because I think it's a really interesting idea. But I do think that we need to make sure that education opportunities outside of the classroom are increasingly available, to make sure that our children are still learning. Because remember that developmentally, that's part of the point of being a child, is that you learn. The brain craves that activity. The brain craves that creation of knowledge. And even things that we as teachers, that we as adults might not think of as learning, such as play, that is learning. Our EYFS Key Stage 1, our early years colleagues know this better than anybody, that you learn through play. And so, our kids are learning while they are on their PlayStation. Other games consoles are, of course, available. They are learning while they are out in the town doing some shopping. All of these things that children do are learning experiences for them. We just need to make sure, as a society, that the learning experiences that we are offering are as broad as possible. And that doesn't just benefit the children, does it? If we have an increasing number of museums, if we have an increasing number of libraries, if we have an increasing number of leisure centres, those things are more available, more accessible to adults as well. which will just enrich all of our lives. So yeah, I am in favour of doing away with homework, so long as there are opportunities, there are enriching opportunities to take its place. Now, I've mentioned cultural capital a few times in there. If you're not entirely sure about that concept, if cultural capital is something that is new to you, I did do a show about it in conjunction with Pearson the last summer. It was the beginning of last summer. So please do go back through the TTR archives and have a listen to that if you're interested in the concept of cultural capital. It's me and some other teachers and representatives from Pearson, and we're talking about how important it is for our children to have as much access to culture, however you define that, as possible. I am, in fact, the only TTR show on today, I believe, according to the schedule that I just checked before coming on, at least. So, you've got plenty of time this afternoon to go back through the archives and to find that special show that we did, and kind of enrich your own life by learning a little bit about cultural capital. But of course, that's not why I'm here today. I've already told you what we're going to talk about today. We are talking about wise feedback. So, if you want to join in the conversation, you can do as Tim did at the top of the show, and you can text in if you are listening live via Podbean. Your message can go straight into the app. It comes through to me here in the studio, and I will read it out on air. Please do say if you don't want me to read it out, because I do just tend to assume that any messages that come through are fit for airing. So if you're just trying to message me privately, please do say that to begin with. If you are not listening live in Podbean, if you are listening elsewhere, because here on TTR we are available all over the internet, anywhere that podcasts can be accessed, then there are a couple of other ways that you can get in touch with me. Twitter is the easiest one. I'm aware that I still call it Twitter. I probably should be doing like everybody else and calling it X, formerly known as Twitter. I'll get there eventually. I will get there eventually. Rebranding always takes me a minute. But you can tweet me or X me, or whatever it is, whatever the new verb is. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER. That's all one word. No hyphens, no underscores, nothing like that. Let me know what you think about wise feedback. And again, I will read your message live on air. If you are not listening live, because of course all of our shows here at Teachers Talk Radio can be downloaded as podcasts for future listening, so it may not be 9:28 on Saturday the 14th of September for you. It could be any time, really. You can still tweet me, because as long as I am alive and as long as I am working in education, these will be topics that interest me, and particularly this one, because like I said, this concept of wise feedback is quite new to me. The crux of my show today is a study. So I will tweet out the link to this study a bit later on for anybody who wants to actually read the research and not just take my word for it. Because again, as I like to say when I give my talks and things, I'm very happy to summarize research. My practice is research informed, because I think that's really important, and I believe in doing the research. I am currently a doctoral student, and so a big part of my workload right now is reading research and conducting my own research. So, I am biased in that way, but the research is done for a reason. Teachers are notoriously bad at engaging with the research, mostly because, as I've talked about on the show before, we just don't have time. Which is why I always think it's good when you can listen to a podcast, or you can go to an inset and somebody will summarize the research for you. But I do always advocate reading the research for yourself, because different people will interpret results in different ways. And even as the audience for the research, we may interpret the results differently to the researchers themselves. So it's always a good idea to go and have a read of the research, to listen to the experts, of course. We learned that during COVID. Um, but to read the research for yourself, actual research, not just Facebook posts about it, and come to your own conclusions about these things. So the paper that kind of initiated this concept of wise feedback is called, and this is a really interesting title, which I think kind of gets to the crux of what wise feedback is. It's called Breaking the Cycle of Mistrust: Wise Interventions to Provide Critical Feedback Across the Racial Divide. And it's by David Scott Yeager, Valerie Purdy-Vaughns, Julio Garcia, Nancy Apfel, Patty Brzustowski, Alison Master, William T. Hessert, Matthew E. Williams, and Jeffrey L. Cohen. So a big group of researchers there working on this. And when you hear that title, when I read that title, two things jumped out at me. The first was mistrust, and the second was the racial divide. And that kind of gets to the crux of how the researchers looked at wise feedback. First, there was this idea of whether or not your pupils actually trust the feedback that you are giving. And I think that can provoke a gut reaction. It did with me. It provoked the reaction of course my pupils trust me. You know, I tick all the right boxes, I build the relationships, I do all of that stuff. Obviously, my kids trust me. But when I took a step back from that gut reaction and I separated ego, if we're honest, from truth, I actually think it's very difficult to know whether your pupils trust you. And that's not about us. That's not about us at all. There are all sorts of reasons why a young person may not trust an adult, which has got nothing to do with the adult in question. And we know that our young people are very good at smiling and nodding and saying, yes, I understand, yes, that's all good, because they think that that's what you want to hear. And if a young person is having issues with trust, they may be more inclined to tell you what they think you want to hear, because they think that that's going to be their way of not getting into trouble. So we'll talk more about trust as the show goes on. But I do think it's very important as teachers for us to separate out things that we're told make a good teacher, like having positive relationships, you know, having kids that trust you. Oh, isn't it great that child X disclosed this safeguarding issue to you? That means that they trust you. And tying up this idea that being trusted by our children means that you're a good teacher, because that's not an equivalence, because children may have trust issues which have nothing to do with you. And then the racial divide jumped out at me. And the racial divide is not a topic on which I'm qualified to speak at all. I'm a white teacher. I have always taught in predominantly white environments. I live in Gloucestershire. I teach in Gloucestershire. We are a predominantly white community here. But of course, that's not the case everywhere. And so, you know, even though I'm not at all qualified to speak on this issue, I will still summarize kind of what the research, what this paper says. And of course, it's important to note that this research was undertaken in the US, where there is much more racial diversity, certainly, than I have in my local area. And so while race is the kind of central issue of this paper, it's the underpinning of this paper, I think there are lots of ways that we can kind of substitute in different minority characteristics, different protected characteristics, different reasons why children may be mistrustful. So I do think that even though this paper kind of centralizes race, the theory itself, the wise feedback itself, is extendable. It is relevant to much wider groups. So this paper was looking at how feedback can be delivered in a way that promotes improvement without undermining motivation, particularly within racial divides, or particularly across racial divides. The focus of the paper was on minority adolescents, particularly African American students, who statistically may mistrust their authority figures more than other types of students. And again, like I've said, there are more reasons than race alone as to why a child may mistrust adults. And then the concept that they come up with is this idea of wise feedback, which emphasizes high standards and it emphasizes the belief in a student's potential. So it's kind of about making sure our feedback is student-centered, is individual-centered. So the challenge that we have when giving feedback to anybody is being able to deliver it and being able to deliver critical feedback without triggering mistrust. Because again, that's a defense mechanism that is common in so many people. The more that I'm talking this morning, the more I'm realizing that I'm a very defensive person, because I seem to be telling you lots of stories today about times that I've been defensive. But I remember once having a lesson observation by a teacher who was senior to me in rank but hadn't been teaching as long as I had. And it came with this whole list of criticism. And my gut reaction was, I don't need to listen to any of this because you are not as experienced as I am. Which, let's be honest, is pure nonsense. I think, you can receive feedback, you can receive criticism from anybody, regardless of how long they have been in the profession for. And as teachers, we know that we quite often get criticism and feedback from people who have never been in the profession at all. And it's not the reception of feedback that's the issue. It is how you deal with it. So, I didn't like the feedback that I was receiving, which upon later reflection, most of it, 90% of it was fair. There are a couple of comments in there that I remember dismissing because that was just like personality in the classroom. But the rest of it was perfectly fair when I thought back on the lesson. But my gut reaction was to be mistrustful of the feedback, not of the person, but of the feedback, because the person giving it didn't have the same experience that I did. And if I, as an adult, with no reason to have been mistrustful of this person's feedback, other than the fact that I didn't like it, if I can be mistrustful in that situation, then so can the children in my classroom who may have perfectly legitimate reasons for being mistrustful of adults, for being mistrustful of what they're being told. Now, of course, some of the kids in my classroom may very well be like me and just jump on the defensive. But as we know from all of our safeguarding training, from all of our child protection training, there are a lot of reasons why a child may be mistrustful of an adult. And if you don't trust the person giving feedback, you're not going to take it on board. If you don't believe that the person giving feedback knows what they're talking about, then you're not going to accept it. And that's really important. That's kind of at the heart of wise feedback. So mistrust, according to this study, mistrust in receiving feedback occurs when individuals doubt the intent behind a critical evaluation. This mistrust can then be exacerbated by past experiences with either bias or discrimination, which then leads individuals to question whether that feedback is genuinely meant to help them to improve or if it's motivated by some kind of prejudice. Now, I've talked before on the show about how I once had a teacher who very much did not like me. And so was very critical of my practice at all stages. And I think if I'm fair to the person who did the observation that I just talked about, I think a lot of my gut reaction to the criticism that I received came from a place of not trusting people who were senior to me, because I knew that the previous feedback that I had been being given was unfair, or because I felt, let's be fair, because I felt that the previous feedback being given to me was unfair. And again, the mistrust that I had, that jumping on the defense to that feedback, was nothing to do with the person giving it to me. I really liked them. I got on really, really well with them. It was nothing to do with that person. It was all to do with me. It was all to do with me. And of course, the person giving the feedback, they couldn't control how I respond to it. As I've mentioned on the show before, before becoming a teacher, I was professionally a performer. I acted and I sang. And one of the biggest things I was told by my agent was to never read the reviews, because the reviews are not for me. The reviews are for the audience. Because there will be lots of good reviews, and it's very easy to read those good reviews and be flattered. But there will also be negative reviews, because not everyone is going to like your performance. And that's something that I really try to bring into my teaching when I personally receive feedback, is the fact that not everybody is going to have liked a lesson. That doesn't mean that it was a bad lesson. It just means that the person watching it didn't like it. Those are two very different things. I know if it was a bad lesson because I come out and tell myself that was a really bad lesson. So I think it's really important. And as I'm talking, the more I realize that this doesn't just apply to giving feedback to our children. For those of us who are in management positions where we do manage other adults, wise feedback can also be good for dealing with them, because you don't always know what they've been through. You don't always know whether they are coming to you from a position of trust or mistrust. So the key factors that contribute to mistrust in feedback can include attribution or ambiguity. So that's this uncertainty about whether feedback is based on actual performance or stereotype. Stereotype threat, which is related to this. So people who belong to groups that are negatively stereotyped in certain domains may suspect that the feedback reflects the stereotype as opposed to the reality of their situation, which can then lead to them dismissing the feedback outright. And again, this is not about saying that as teachers we have unconscious bias. That's a whole other show. That was a whole other inset day that I did a couple of years ago on unconscious bias. So this isn't grounded in us as the teacher. It's grounded in the pupils. It's grounded in the people receiving the feedback. They may perceive unconscious bias even where there isn't any. And that perception may lead them to reject the feedback. There may be a general lack of trust in institutions, such as the school, because if students don't accept school as an institution, if they don't believe that school is important, then they will reject the feedback. And this is one of the big issues that I think we have in the UK, is where the notion of school is being constantly undermined. And teachers as professionals are being undermined. Not only does that negatively impact us, but it also negatively impacts the education that our children receive, because they grow up, they grow up hearing this negativity about teachers, about the institution of school. And so they mistrust it, and so they reject the help that we are trying to give them in their attempts to grow, in their attempts to improve. And mistrust can then reduce motivation to improve after receiving feedback, because if feedback is perceived as being biased or unfair, students may disengage from the learning process, which then prevents improvement, and it reinforces this negative cycle of underperformance, and so reinforces the perceived mistrust, and it becomes this vicious cycle that just self-perpetuates. So if there is mistrust between the pupil and the feedback giver, if there's mistrust between the feedback receiver and the feedback giver, then critical feedback can be dismissed, which hinders learning and improvement. And so the goal here is to reduce the attributional ambiguity by building trust. So again, if you are one of those teachers who prides themselves on being trusted by their pupils, that's fantastic. Maybe this show is not for you because you have already achieved that. But if you are not sure, or if you want to improve that trusting relationship, then interestingly, a positive feedback cycle is one way that you can do that. Because giving feedback is a big part of us as teachers, as of our jobs. And so it's one of the big ways in which we can build that concept of trust.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the programme with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for Bet UK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, Bet has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
So, wise feedback then was coined to try and reduce this mistrust. And it's trying to do that by building trust through an explanation that the feedback being given reflects the high standards of the teacher and the belief of the teacher that the students can meet them. So it boils down to 3 very simple steps. Okay, this does not give a lot of extra work when you're doing your marking. If anything, it should reduce the work when giving feedback, because it can kind of become quite formulaic eventually. And the 3 components are the emphasis of high standards, the affirmation of the belief in the student's ability, and the providing of actionable, detailed feedback. Notice that I'm not asking my students to respond to the feedback. They don't have to sign it. They don't have to come up with an action plan about how they're going to implement it. And the reason for that is that us doing that is a mistrustful exercise. Why do we get children to sign to say that they've read our marking? Why do we get children to come up with a my response is? It's because we don't believe that they're actually going to read it. And by getting them to do something in response, we're reinforcing that belief. We're saying to them, I don't trust that you care enough about your education to read what I've told you you need to do to improve, so I'm going to force you to read it. That builds up the mistrust. It increases that rejection of feedback cycle. So part of the wise feedback approach, I think, is about trusting the students to act on it. And I think for lots of teachers that can be really difficult because, of course, as teachers we are judged, we shouldn't be, but we are judged by our students' performance as opposed to our own performance. So if you want to be perceived as a good teacher, you are going to want to make sure that your children are acting on the feedback, because it's through acting on the feedback that they will improve. We know that. And it's through that improvement that you will be perceived as a good teacher, and you can control whether or not they are acting on that feedback by controlling whether or not they read it. But ultimately, our children's education isn't about us. It's about them. And at some point, you do have to trust them. You do have to hand over the reins and say, you're going to choose whether or not you want to improve. And I'm going to give you the freedom to do that. I'm going to give you the trust to do that. So I do think that for this approach to work institutionally, we do need to have a culture shift. We're doing really, really well by removing Ofsted's one-word gradings. We're doing very well, I think, in the schools that have removed one-word gradings for their individual teacher observations. The schools that are moving more towards a coaching and modelling model of professional development. I think the last step is for us as teachers to stop tying up our professional worth with our pupils' outcomes, and to realise that actually it's the quality of our lessons that that decide whether we are good teachers or not, and not the pupil's response to them. So this is one of the things that I like about wise feedback, is that it is pupil-centred. It's not about me as the teacher. It's about them as the learner, which I think is what our job is about. So step 1 is that communication of high expectations. So you start by being very explicit about the fact that you've asked them to do something difficult. I know this feels like it's a very challenging task, and it is. Learning how to write a book report is a new skill that you've not been asked to do before, but it will help you to think about your skill set as a book reviewer for when you write your research in future. Giving a presentation in front of the entire class can feel very scary, but it's important for job interviews. Okay, so you are being very explicit with your students about why you have your high expectations and how your high expectations are going to benefit them. Now, yes, this does feel a bit like writing the learning objective on the whiteboard. And you just, the gut instinct is to go, well, of course I have high expectations. Why would I not? Why do I have to make that explicit? But sometimes children don't know that we know how hard the tasks we're setting them are. And that can be really demotivating. It can be really demoralizing if they do find it difficult. So by being very clear about having high expectations, you are saying to the child, look, I know that I'm asking a lot of you, but that's okay. I'm not going to stop. This is also how, for those of us who are not the strict teacher, the scary teacher, this is how we can, if we feel the need to, continue to make it very explicit that we have high expectations. Because I think it's usually the strict teacher or the scary teacher who is seen as being the teacher who has high expectations. But they're not the only ones who do. The rest of us just approach it in a different way. So I think if you ever feel like it is perceived that your expectations are not high enough because you're not the scary teacher, then putting them in writing, and again, this is completely contradicting what I said just now about how we shouldn't put things in writing just to justify our own practice. But I think if you do feel like you need to make it clear to people who are not just your kids that you have high expectations, this is a really good way to do it. Why should we have high expectations? Because we should. That's kind of how it feels, doesn't it? It kind of feels like we have high expectations because we should have high expectations. We have high expectations because they're in the teaching standards. But actually, why is it important to have high expectations? Why is it important to challenge our pupils? Because we shouldn't ever do anything in a classroom without understanding why we're doing it. There are three reasons, I think, of why we should have high expectations. This could be its own whole show, but I'm just going to go through it very, very quickly now. The first is the Pygmalion effect, or self-fulfilling prophecy. Students perform better when their teachers expect more from them. Rosenthal and Jacobson in 1968 demonstrated this because I'm a bit iffy on the ethics of this study, but they labeled a random selection of kids as intellectual bloomers, and they told them that they were intellectual bloomers. And those kids made significant academic progress compared to their peers, simply because they were told that they were good. So there is this idea that if someone is told that they are being held to a high standard and they meet it, they are more likely to meet high standards because they believe that they can. High standards, high expectations help to close the achievement gap. There was a 2016 report by the Education Trust which found that students of colour and students from low-income families were not always given access to advanced coursework. So, we do have instances of institutional discrimination here, which of course can build that mistrust. But when those students were given access to advanced coursework, they did just as well as their peers, because of course they did. because your race and your economic status, your family's economic status, your parents' economic status have got nothing to do with your academic capabilities. There are other factors, access to the work, access to cultural capital, all of that sort of stuff. But the actual intellectual ability, the academic ability, is completely unrelated. And finally, long-term success. There was a 2012 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research which found that students who were held to higher academic standards were more likely to graduate from high school. So again, all this research is American, but it's transferable. They were more likely to graduate high school. They were more likely to go to university. And so it shows that having high standards of your pupils helps with long-term academic progress because you're setting them up to succeed. High standards are not unobtainable standards. They are not ridiculous. They are, this is what I expect of you, and you can do it. Step 2 then, once you have outlined the fact that you have got high standards and that the task that you asked them to complete, the task that you're feeding back on, was one of a high standard, you explain that you believe the student can meet the expectations. Your work up until now has already demonstrated that you can do X and Y really, really well. I'm teaching, let's say, the present tense in French. I did a lesson with my ER verbs. My students learned that they take off their ER and they add E, ES, E, ONS, EZ, ENT. They did some work on it. They did really well. My next lesson, I do my IR verbs. They learn that they take off their IR. They add IS, IT, ISS, ONS, ISSEZ, ISSENT. They do really well in that. I do my RE verbs. The students learn that they take off their RE, they add S, nothing, ONS, EZ, ENT. But Jill doesn't do very well on this one. She did very, very well in ER and IR, but RE was just one step too far. It was too much too soon. So I say to her, your work this week on the present tense has demonstrated that you can already do ER and IR verbs really, really well. I'm reinforcing that she can do it, that I'm not expecting her to do something that she cannot do. You scored 9 out of 10 on your spelling test last week, which shows me that you understand the ideas behind these concepts. Your first draft has got some excellent points, so I know that you are fully capable of meeting the expectations for the final essay. So again, you are just reinforcing the fact that the student can meet your expectations. Now, maybe, let's be realistic, maybe they can't. Maybe this specific concept they're not quite ready for yet. Particularly if you're dealing with youngest children, maybe it's outside of their zone of proximal development. But you can call on feedback from something else that you've done that has been similar to show that they will be able to do it in the future, even if they're not quite getting it right now. When we were doing the Tudors, your work about Henry VIII, your story about Henry VIII was wonderful. So the next time we try writing a story about plate tectonics, I know that you will be able to do it. And you can then put the emphasis on the future instead of on the present, by still showing that you understand that they can produce good work, by still referring back to something that they have already done really, really well. Why do we do that? Why should we tell them that they can succeed? Why are we moving away from, the 1940s, 1950s teacher who believed that you motivate somebody by telling them they're stupid? The reason for that is that there is so much research that documents the link between teacher expectation and student performance and achievement. So again, it's about having high expectations, and it's about being explicit of the fact that our students can meet them. Research by Ruby Davis found that teacher expectations can affect not only academic achievement, but also the quality of teacher-student interaction. If you are a teacher who prides themselves on how you interact with your pupils, on your relationships with your pupils, then having high expectations of those pupils can improve that. Sometimes it can feel like the reverse. Sometimes it does feel like having lower expectations improves your relationship because they don't need to work as hard to meet your expectations, and they like that. But we know from all of the stories we hear that the teachers that people remember, the teachers that our students ultimately really do come to respect, are the ones that challenge them and are the ones that have these high expectations. And you only know that someone has high expectations of you. You only know if someone believes in you if they tell you. You can say, oh, my curriculum is designed in a way that shows the children I believe that they can access it. But you're then just assuming that they can make that inference. It's much better just to tell them, explicitly tell them that you believe that they can meet your expectations. The American Psychological Association produced some research which discusses how teacher expectations can influence self-efficacy in students. And high teacher expectations promote student confidence, promote student motivation, promote a mindset that they can succeed. Ultimately, when students believe that their teacher has confidence in their abilities, they are more likely to engage in the learning task and persist in the face of a challenge. Because we're the teacher, because we know what the good work looks like. We're the teacher because we know what the end result should be. So if we are building up that trust, and this is where the mistrust can also come in, but if we're building up that trust, then our pupils can look at us and they can go, okay, Mr. Lester knows that a good A-level Chinese assignment has elements X, Y, and Z, so that's what I'm going to put into it. Because he knows the marking criteria, he knows how I can get my A star so that I can get into my Russell Group University to study Chinese. So it's about having that external motivation, I suppose, which doesn't always come from stickers and house points and whatever else it might be that we are giving out. Sometimes it comes from having an adult who believes in you. Sometimes it comes from having a grown-up, or no, not even somebody older than you, I suppose, because, we as teachers, we might often go to an inset or to a course or do a degree, and our tutor is younger than we are. So I guess it's about having the person who is the next level up in terms of the academics that you are learning say to you, I know what this looks like, and I know that you can achieve it. Then that third step is the actual, I was about to say the actual feedback, but that's wrong because this whole thing is feedback. The whole process is feedback. It's the next steps, the process of improvement, the actionable steps. The feedback I gave you on your draft is where you should start when you write the next version. I'm really excited to read your final essay. Looking at your test scores, you should probably start to revise your ER and IR verbs so that you feel as comfortable with them as you do with your RE verbs, which you did really well on. So I'm telling them what to do. And I'm not necessarily telling them what they should do next time we do a task like this. I'm telling them what they can do right now in order to get better at the concept I've just assessed, be it formatively or summatively. So that action can be taken immediately, so a child feels like they are making immediate progress, so they are more likely to continue. And I know this from my own studies. If you open up some feedback and you read it and you go, yep, that's fair, that's great, that's really helpful, I know what to do, but then you close the email and don't work on the essay, don't work on the assignment until, let's say, a week later, you kind of lose that momentum. You lose that initial boost of, okay, my teacher is saying that I can do well in this, so I'm going to go and do well. And you can kind of fall back into your own normal mindset. So it's really good to give them the opportunity to action the feedback straight away. And again, notice this doesn't mean that I'm giving them an extra task to do in response to my feedback. I'm not now setting aside half of my lesson so that they can respond to the feedback, and so I'm then losing time. I'm saying to them, you can go away and do this. And actually, this could tie in quite nicely to the discussion that we were having before about homework. You know, if we stopped being so controlling with homework, and we built up that trust so that our children wanted to engage and they wanted to learn. And so homework kind of became about reading your feedback and acting on it. And if you don't do that, if you're choosing not to do your homework, well, you're the one who is impacted because you're the one who is not learning. And we gave them that accountability. That might be a way to get around that and to build up that trust. Because again, I'm not sitting there and making them do something. I'm telling them that I believe that they want to improve. I trust them to go and do the work. So it's all about giving them the responsibility, I think. Feedback needs to be actionable because it fosters self-regulation and independence. A study by Nicole and McFarlane Dick in 2006 said that feedback focusing on actionable steps empowers students to take responsibility for their own learning, because if we understand what specific actions are needed to improve, we can begin to self-assess our own work and make adjustments independently, which then increases our self-confidence, it increases our self-efficacy. Actionable feedback reduces confusion and frustration. A study by Brookhart in 2011 showed that actionable feedback gives students a sense of direction, whereas, just woolly, generalized feedback that they can't really do anything with leaves them feeling more confused, because they understand that they didn't perform as well as they could have, but they're not sure how to do better. And actionable feedback improves long-term retention and application. In skills-based subjects, which these days is just about every subject, giving a piece of actionable feedback can help a child to remember how to do that skill, because it gives them more exposure to it, like I was talking about before with the cultural capital. If your feedback is you should go and review your RE verbs, you are telling them, take the time to go back over, have this additional exposure to this concept. And we know that additional exposure, we know that time dedicated to a concept is what helps to embed it. So those are the 3 steps of the WISE feedback. You explain that you have high expectations. You affirm that your students can reach those expectations, that you believe your students can reach those expectations. Then you give an action. You tell them what they should do next.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for Bet UK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, Bet has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
So to finish off, let's have a look at how the researchers of this study implemented their WISE feedback and what their results were. The study itself looked at a group of 7th grade, so that's year 8 in England. That's kind of 12 and 13-year-olds, African American and white students. The objective of the study was to test whether the WISE feedback methodology improved students' motivation to revise their work and whether it enhanced their trust in their teachers. They did a double-blind randomized field experiment across 3 different studies. The first study looked at revising essays, redrafting, rewriting their essays. 44 students were given feedback with either a WISE note, so they were either given WISE feedback or a neutral note. The results showed that 71% of African American students who received the WISE feedback acted on that feedback and revised their essay, compared to only 17% in the control group. And from this, the researchers concluded that WISE feedback led to more revisions, particularly for students who have culturally lower levels of trust. Study 2 looked at the quality of those revisions, because, of course, there's no point in doing a second draft if you don't actually make it better. So the students were required to revise their essays, and then the quality of that work was assessed. The African American students in the WISE feedback group improved their essay scores significantly more than in the control group. Now, I don't actually have the stats for what the researchers consider to be significantly, so we are going to kind of take that with a pinch of salt. And their key findings therein were that WISE feedback leads to better quality revision, which shows a direct improvement in academic performance. Because, of course, the better your final essay is, the higher your score is going to be. And study 3 then looked at the long-term effects. So a group of 9th grade students, that's year 10, kind of 14, 15, they were taught to attribute critical feedback to the teacher's high standards and beliefs in their potential. There was then, they reported increased trust and improved grades amongst the African American students, which reduced that achievement gap. And the conclusion that they came to was that WISE feedback interventions can have lasting impacts on trust and so academic performance. So essentially, through this study, and again, I will tweet a link out to this study so that you can go and read it for yourselves, because of course I spent quite a long time telling you what WISE feedback is and how to implement it, because I think that's the important bit. But if you want to go ahead and read for yourself what the outcomes of that were in this study, I will make that available to you. But the key takeaway from the study is that WISE feedback emphasizes high standards and belief in students' abilities, which in turn can break any kind of cycle of mistrust, and it can promote better academic outcomes, particularly for minority students. And of course, in terms of this study, that refers to racial minority students, but of course, that can be applied to any kind of protected characteristic. It would be interesting, and I think if there are any researchers out there listening, or perhaps any future doctoral students who are trying to come up with a thesis, you could look at how WISE feedback applied to other protected characteristics, applied to girls, applied to LGBTQ identifying students, applied to adult learners. It would be interesting to see whether the same kinds of effects are reported. And there are long-term benefits, because that building of trust leads to sustained academic improvement and a reduction in the racial disparity in educational achievement. Because essentially what you are doing by building up your personal trust with your students, you are also building up institutional trust. You are showing your students that schools are a place that will support them and protect them and lead them to be the best versions of themselves that they can be, regardless of what they may be hearing outside, regardless of other experiences that they may have had. And for a lot of us, that can be really important. A job that I had a few years ago, which I really enjoyed, was working with adult students who were retaking their GCSE in English. You know, maybe they didn't take it the first time round. Maybe they didn't do as well as they had wanted the first time round, and so we're going to do it again. Maybe the grade that they received the first time round was perfectly good then, but now they're after a career change, and so they need a higher grade. And it was really important for me when I was teaching those adults to build up that trust, not because they didn't trust the academic institution, the institution of academia, because they had come to learn through being adults, through their life experience, that learning is important, but because they had mistrust in their own previous academic achievement. So even though kind of the study on wise feedback was focused around trust of the institution and trust of the teacher, and I've kind of focused on that today, there is also a lack of trust, or there can also be a lack of trust in the self, particularly if you are dealing with older learners, with A-level students, with university students, with adults. So trust is important in education. Because if you don't trust the person giving you the feedback, if you don't believe that the person giving you the feedback knows what they're talking about, you're not going to accept it. And if you don't accept the feedback, you are not going to progress. We are far, far away from the days where teachers are trusted just by virtue of being teachers. I'm not going to comment on whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I actually don't know. But it's a fact. We are no longer trusted just because we have our teaching qualification. And so we've got to prove to our students that we do know what we're talking about, that we are the people who are best equipped to get them to where they need to be. And if we can do that and we can build up that trust, that academic trust, then academic outcomes are going to improve. I do hope that you have found this morning interesting. I hope you found it as interesting as I did when I learned about this concept, when I started doing the research into it. I would be interested if any of you listening choose to implement the WISE feedback process over the next few weeks, months, how you find it. I'm going to implement it myself with my students, and then I've got it penciled in kind of towards the end of the academic year to talk about how I have found that process. So if anybody else tries that and would like to join me for that show in June, then please do get in touch. I would love to have you on. Otherwise, I will just tell you about my experiences. Or even if you don't want to be on the show, but you do want to share your experience of WISE feedback, please do tweet me. Like I said at the start of the show, I am at Mr. D. Lester. That's MIDLESTER. That's all one word. And let me know how you get on. Like I said earlier, I believe I'm the only live show that we have on the network today. So I hope that I have been worth your while. Do spend some time this afternoon, if you have got some time, going back through the archives. So many amazing hosts we have here at Teachers Talk Radio. So many different experiences, different viewpoints. You can hear the same show on the same topic from two different hosts and get two completely different ideas, which is one of the joys of teaching and one of the joys of being here, is that it really does help to broaden your horizons. If you choose not to do that, and instead you're going to go and make the most of the sunshine, because it's quite sunny here in Gloucestershire. It's crisp but sunny. It's a proper autumn day. Then I wish you a great rest of the weekend, and I will see you next Saturday. I am very much looking forward to it. I hope that you do too. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.